The Denver Broncos are leaving no stone unturned as they found another player from the UFL. Cornerback Mario Goodrich is in the fold, and that might mean that Damari Mathis is on the trade block. We're going to talk about that and much more coming up next on today's episode, Locked On Broncos.
You are Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
The Denver Broncos have signed another cornerback to what was already the best position group on the team. What does that mean for Damari Mathis? What does it mean for the other position groups on the roster that could maybe use some upgrading here as we get into the meat of the 2025 offseason? We're going to talk about all of that on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. But welcome in Broncos country. My name is Sayre Bettinger. I'm the co-host here at Locked On Broncos, as well as the site expert over there at predominantlyorange.com. And we always appreciate you for tuning in, especially this time of year where you know that your boys Cody and Sayre will have you covered every single day with some fresh perspective, content, analysis, and coverage of anything that goes on for your favorite team, the Denver Broncos, including the signing of a very interesting player. The Broncos bringing in UFL standout cornerback Mario Goodrich, who played his college football at Clemson, won a national championship there. As a matter of fact, early on in his collegiate career, spent a couple of years in the NFL with the New York Giants and the Philadelphia Eagles before getting his shot at the UFL level, where he played 5 games last season, racked up 15 total tackles and 4 passes broken up. Goodrich, a physical player. You can see that when you watch some of his highlights. He's got solid ball skills. And what he brings to the Denver Broncos is an interesting blend of developmental upside at cornerback, as he's only 25 years old, but also he brings some special teams ability. In 2023 with the Philadelphia Eagles, Goodrich actually played 40 special team snaps. He actually played 70 defensive snaps as well. Remember, in 2023, the Eagles really struggled to figure out their business at cornerback, and they shuffled a ton of different guys in. Goodrich was one of them. And to be quite honest, he struggled a lot. He was targeted 10 times in coverage that year, and he allowed 10 receptions, and it was not good. It was a quarterback rating of over 149 into his coverage. So this is a guy that definitely needed the additional reps, the additional development at another level of professional football. And that's why I think the UFL is so great, is that it allows these guys that really need the reps that they're not necessarily getting on an NFL practice squad. Even they need the reps out there in game action to really develop their skills, to be able to play some real football. And yes, it's a completely different level of competition. The best guys from the UFL might be some of your back end roster guys or top end practice squad guys at the NFL level. But as we saw last year with Dondre Tillman, there might be a little more than meets the eye, right? I mean, you don't want to write these guys off immediately. And I think that's what makes a move like this so exciting, is that the Broncos, their scouting department, George Paton, the general manager, they're not going to leave any stone unturned when it comes to finding ways to upgrade this roster, even if it means going after a player who plays a position where you feel like we already have maybe the best group of cornerbacks in the NFL, right? With Defensive Player of the Year Pat Surtain at the top of the depth chart. We recently heard head coach Sean Payton speak very highly of the work that Riley Moss did last year and that he's having a good offseason. And then you have Jaquan McMillan playing well in the slot. You brought in Jahdae Barron with your first round pick in the 2025 NFL draft. Chris Abrams-Draine had a really good rookie season for the Denver Broncos, at least in terms of the opportunity that he got late in the year. So you have already an embarrassment of riches at the position. Why would you go after a guy like this? Well, we know the saying goes, you can never have too many good corners. I always bring this quote up because I think it's so important to remember. But Vic Fangio once said, across the NFL, there's essentially 96 starting cornerbacks if you count the nickel, because teams spend 60 or more percent of the time, if not well above that, in their nickel alignment, which means they've got 3 corners on the field at all times. So you figure 32 NFL teams, basically 3 starting roles for the cornerback position. You've essentially got to have 5 or 6 guys at that position. And Vic Fangio he pointed out, like, there's not 96 starting caliber corners in the NFL. George Paton has consistently, from the very first pick that he made, which was Pat Surtain, he's consistently emphasized the importance of drafting and developing defensive backs and having just a plethora of those guys at your disposal. And yeah, the Broncos have found guys from the first round of the draft to the undrafted free agent scrap heap, right? So they're not above looking at the UFL level to say, hey, this guy is somebody that we liked coming out of college, or maybe he's somebody that they scouted in the preseason. Actually, what's really interesting about this move? The Broncos, remember, they shuffled around some of their front office this offseason. Jordan Dizon, a former NFL linebacker who spent a number of years in the Denver Broncos front office, he actually was working with the Philadelphia Eagles in their front office from 2022 to 2024. And he was there as one of their pro scouting department guys, and in part of bringing in Mario Goodrich when he was let go by the New York Giants after the 2022 season. So the Eagles brought in Goodrich. They gave him some playing time. And I think it's no coincidence now, as we know, the ties that bind, they really matter in the NFL. You've now got Jordan Dizon back in the Denver Broncos front office as their director of pro scouting. And you see Goodrich coming in as one of those guys who joins a 91-man roster that we don't know what the corresponding roster move was, but Goodrich did get a 1-year deal. And you have to think that maybe Jordan Dizon did a little bit of pounding of the table for this guy. And you scout all these different players because you never know, like a Dondre Tillman last year, or remember even Devontae Bosby played a key role for Vic Fangio's defense a couple of years back, even if it was just for a couple of games and it didn't end up working out. He kind of had that little flash in the pan there for the Denver Broncos, even if it's just a special teams thing. And Darren Rizzi certainly is watching these guys tape. You get all these informed opinions about a player like Mario Goodrich, and you add him to the roster because you believe, like, there's a chance that we can make something out of this. There's a chance that even if he ends up on the practice squad in 2025, that down the road, we might be able to get something out of him. Again, he's only 25 years old, and he's got some physicality to him. He's got some NFL experience, which I think is fascinating. And then he was productive and consistent in the UFL in the games that he did play. So after going after Dondre Tillman last year, maybe building up some confidence towards making more moves like this in the future, I just think it's healthy for the Broncos to do things like this. It's always good to take calculated risks on players when you have a 90-man roster, when you can afford to say, let's get a look at this guy in the offseason program. Let's get a look at him at training camp. Let's see how he does against our young wide receivers. Let's see how he stacks up against some of the other corners that we've brought in. And let's see what he can do on special teams, because that is going to be a major factor in breaking down the bottom 5 or 6 guys that make this Denver Broncos roster. There's going to be players on this roster like Caleb Lohner, maybe a third quarterback, maybe a fourth running back, who are consistently inactive on game days. Maybe it's even a 6th receiver, right? Because the Broncos, they might rotate a lot of guys, but they might not use 6 receivers every single Sunday. So you figure these guys have got to play roles on special teams. If you're a back-end roster guy, the Broncos are already going to be allocating roster spots to players who might be draft and stash guys, or they might be sign and stash developmental undrafted players. Whatever the case may be, there are certain guys that this team signed or drafted that aren't going to be, they're not planning on having those guys thrust into the lineup right away. They are going to be developing, and the Broncos aren't going to subject them to waivers because they don't want other teams that like these players like Caleb Lohner getting out there and being subject to that. So there's going to be guys like that on the roster. So when you bring in a player like this, the expectation has got to be to contribute on special teams right away. And of course, there is impact elsewhere on the roster. As a matter of fact, there's impact directly at the cornerback position, something that we've brought up a couple of times, but might be given a violent shove into the realistic category at this point, is a trade for Damari Mathis. The Broncos were already deep at corner. Now you bring in another guy with some special teams ability. Broncos could save quite a bit of cash by moving on from Damari Mathis, and it seems like now that's only a matter of time. We're going to be talking about Damari Mathis's situation coming up next on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. Today's episode of Locked On Broncos is brought to you by Monarch Money. Ever check your bank account and wonder, where did all my money go, right? Between dining out, online shopping, and entertainment, it's easy to lose track, and that is where Monarch Money comes in. It's your personal CFO giving you full visibility and control over your finances. And Monarch Money, it's not just a budgeting app, right? It's a complete financial command center. You can track all your accounts, your investments, and your spending all in one place. So you stop just managing your money and you start building wealth. When I started using Monarch Money, I realized just how much I was spending on things like food delivery or oftentimes coffee. So now I budget smarter and I save more. So take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use the code LOCKEDONNFL at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. That's monarchmoney.com, code LOCKEDONNFL for half off your first year. Damari Mathis is one of those players for the Denver Broncos that could be on the chopping block after the team's recent move. We're going to break down the financial implications of Damari Mathis here on the roster, as well as what trading him could look like, what teams might be interested in trading for him, and what the Broncos might also be looking at to potentially add even more to this roster. A general manager's job is never done, Broncos country, but want to also say thank you to all of you that make Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day every single day. If you haven't already done so, and we really appreciate if you take a couple of seconds, hit subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts, as well as on YouTube, where you can also join in the conversation. It's a lot of fun over there, and you get to be with all the other members of Broncos country who love the offseason as much as you do. But Broncos country, what do you think about Damari Mathis and his situation? Because ultimately, this feels like it's been sort of writing on the wall for a little bit now. It feels like Damari Mathis has kind of been on the outside looking in terms of not only playing time, but maybe even the 53-man roster. And one of the things that we bring up pretty frequently here is the idea of doing right by a player. What does that mean? Doing right by a player means that you want that guy to succeed, right? You want players to make the most money that they possibly can. Sean Payton referenced this last year when he was talking about Zach Wilson, right? And he said, our job is to make this guy millions, whether it's here or somewhere else. I think that philosophy applies to every position. Of course, you want to have depth on your roster. Of course, you have to protect yourself in case of injury. You can't just go around willy-nilly and say, hey, we're going to cut this guy because, we want him to get more playing time elsewhere. There are certain situations where you hoard depth, and there's other situations where you realize, all right, this guy is not going to play even if we have an injury or two. That might be the scenario with Damari Mathis right now, because you look at the Broncos cornerback position. Again, we can go through the names: Pat Surtain, Riley Moss, Jahdae Barron, Jaquan McMillan, Chris Abrams-Draine. Now you bring in Mario Goodrich. There's just so many guys out there that they can play special teams. They can play versatile roles. They can start for you if need be. We saw that last year with Chris Abrams-Draine, right? The guy looks like he could be a starting corner in the NFL, and he's 5th on the depth chart right now, which is just wildly encouraging depth for this team at a key position. But somebody like Damari Mathis, unfortunately, is the odd man out with a situation like that. And he looked pretty good after bouncing back from a slow start in his rookie season. Injuries have kind of derailed him a little bit. He got some action last year playing in the dime look for the Denver Broncos defense. He's physical, he's athletic, and the ink is probably still drying on his NFL draft scouting report for a lot of teams out there. But one of the things I think really benefits a player like Damari is that the Broncos have lots of friends in high places elsewhere in the NFL. Let's look at a situation like Carolina, where the Panthers, by the way, rumored to be interested in potentially signing former Broncos safety Justin Simmons. Ejiro Evero being the defensive coordinator there, he's got familiarity with Damari Mathis, and he was part of the coaching staff that drafted him initially back in 2022. So the Panthers, would they be interested in trading for Damari Mathis? What about Darren Muji, who was the assistant general manager in Denver? The New York Jets, a lot of change defensively right now. Of course, you've got Aaron Glenn as the head coach. He's a defensive backs guy. I don't think it would take much for Muj to convince Aaron Glenn that they need to take a shot on Damari Mathis and make him one of their top 3 or 4 corners this coming season. Of course, you've got, Vic Fangio having that, being that Ejiro Evero is sort of a disciple of the Fangio defense in a way. You really feel like there's a chance there that maybe Fangio and the Eagles would like Damari Mathis, especially because he's a guy who played his college ball at Pitt, and that they have, those ties that bind, the local ties, of course, in the Pennsylvania area. So, I mean, you can use the 3 degrees of separation any way that you want, but Damari Mathis is a talented player who's not going to cost you an arm and a leg to acquire, right? I think the Broncos last year, their trade of Baron Browning for a 6th-round pick, I feel like that's a pretty fair deal for somebody like Damari Mathis, especially as much as cornerback is a premium position. The Broncos right now, they're set to take on a $3.6 million cap hit for Damari Mathis in 2025, but they could save almost $3.2 million if they trade or cut him. So that to me indicates that there might be a motivation to get him out of the building, to say we could get up to, that would push the Broncos up near 20 million in total cap space right now, according to overthecap.com. That might motivate a team to do something like that, to say, we can not only get this player in a better situation for him, but we can put ourselves in a favorable situation to, potentially get some of these other deals done that we want to get, like the extensions for Courtland Sutton, Zach Allen, Nick Bonito, John Franklin Myers, all of these situations that are currently looming over the Denver Broncos' head. It's not that they need to utilize all their immediately available cap space, but certainly having that extra cushion helps, especially when you're dealing with a $35 million in dead money from Russell Wilson still this year. So that kind of stuff all adds up. And for somebody like Damari Mathis to be counting $3.6 million against the salary cap, and a consistently inactive player and not necessarily a core guy on special teams, look, he could become that. He could become the next Kayvon Webster. But if he's not playing at a Kayvon Webster level on special teams, then it benefits him and the team to get a draft pick for him, drop some cap space or add some cap space really, and get a guy like that into a better situation where he can thrive. I think that there's a win-win-win all around here for the Broncos, another team that needs cornerback help, and Damari Mathis, who, keep in mind, the guy literally gave the shirt off his back to J.K. Dobbins after Dobbins signed his free agent contract in Denver. The first time we saw him on the field, he was wearing number 27, and everybody's like, hey, that's Damari Mathis's number. I know J.K. said that he gave Damari something nice for number 27, but at the same time, to me, that's kind of a small indicator, and I reiterate there, it is a small indicator of a guy that doesn't maybe have much staying power, is that somebody gets signed to a 1-year contract, just immediately comes in, takes your number. I mean, I don't know. You can read into that what you will, but I think if you read all the different breadcrumbs, all the different tea leaves, everything is leading up to the Denver Broncos likely moving on from Damari Mathis here in the near future, and they have the depth to be able to do that, and they could add to their 2026 NFL draft war chest in the process, or maybe even go after another player. And I don't know, is there other areas of this roster that you want to tinker with at this point? George Paton, Sean Payton, the front office, they're always going to be tinkering with the roster, but a couple of injuries at wide receiver maybe put that position in a place where you go after some risk reward guys. We're going to talk about some remaining roster needs that the Broncos could be on the lookout for some depth here in the coming weeks on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. Where could the Denver Broncos continue to look for depth for their 91-man roster here as we get into the dog days of the offseason? Could they look at wide receiver? Could they look at maybe linebacker? Could they add to another position of strength like the defensive line or the pass rush? We're going to break it all down on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. But after the signing of Mario Goodrich at the cornerback position, I think it's fair to wonder where else might the Broncos try to tinker with the roster as we get into this area of the offseason where the pro scouting department, your general manager, those guys, they might take a little bit of time off, but they're going to get right back into the office and start finding, hey, what stones have we left unturned at this point to try to find players who can contribute to this roster. I think a couple of injuries over the course of minicamp and OTAs for the Denver Broncos could illuminate the potential need for, boom bust type guys at wide receiver. Specifically, the injuries that we're talking about are the injuries to Devon Vele, who was looking on track to be clearly the second guy in line at receiver behind Courtland Sutton prior to his, what we now know from Mike Kliss, our good friend over there at 9 News in Denver, we know to be a leg injury, but no specifics beyond that. He's going to be a full go for training camp, but the injury to A.T. Perry as well wipes off another chess piece off the board to where Perry was one of those guys that you felt like, hey, he could be that wild card with upside, size, big playability, speed. He's got 4 touchdowns at the NFL level already, and he averaged like 20 yards a catch when he was with the Saints. So there's a guy like that offers you some nice upside, at least in your offseason program. And then there's somebody like Devon Vele, who is really a core part of your plans for this coming season. Those two guys being injured over the course of OTAs and minicamp, and even with both potentially being ready for the start of training camp, you got to figure like the Broncos brought in a number of tryout guys at wide receiver over the course of the last month or so. They actually signed one of them, Kyrese White, who's kind of the ultimate roster sleeper, special teams guy. But they also brought in the Colorado wide receiver. And I think that it's really interesting, Will Shepherd. So you bring in guys like this. Why? Because you want to get looks at players who could potentially be on your 91 man roster with the international player exemption, right? You want to get guys that can be out there and be wild card options at training camp. You want to get looks at guys who could potentially be on your practice squad at the beginning of the year. And then you just really never know when somebody's going to come out and absolutely ball out and force a decision on your 53 man roster. So for the Denver Broncos, it's also a matter of you're one injury away now at wide receiver from being in a pretty precarious position, right? You don't want to be in that position to where, all right, we lost Devon Vele in the offseason program. Then Courtland Sutton went down in training camp, hypothetically, of course. But if Courtland Sutton goes down in training camp, all of a sudden you've lost your veteran presence at the wide receiver position and you're relying on all these other guys to pick up the slack. That's where a player like, I think, Evan Ingram could really come into the mix to be that go-to easy button on the offense, right? But if you lose any other players due to injury, or if you start to have this, lose the battle in the war on attrition, right? You start to lose guys left and right. All of a sudden now you're in a pretty rough position. The free agent class at wide receiver, it's not deep right now by any means. And you don't figure teams are going to be just cutting good players at that position. So if you're the Broncos, right now is kind of the time when you want to look and see what's available for boom or bust type propositions, low risk, potentially high reward signings at wide receiver that could help out your team. And I think a number of other positions, right? I mean, I think you could look at tight end as well, where the Broncos right now, you've got Evan Ingram and nothing else really as in terms of proven receiving threats at the position. Remember, Adam Troutman led the team last year with 188 receiving yards at the tight end position. Lucas Krull led the group with 19 catches. It was not good. It was actually miserable to watch. And so do you try to find a low risk, high reward proposition at the tight end position? Broncos have brought in a number of guys so far this offseason to try and kind of maybe do something like that. They've brought in a couple of tryout players. They brought in the undrafted rookie out of Ole Miss. And so they're taking some looks, but there might be an opportunity to do even a little bit more here as we get deeper into the offseason. I think inside linebacker, that continues to be a question mark area. And of course, we assume Dre Greenlaw and Alex Singleton are going to be out there at training camp running around. The Broncos will obviously know that better than any of us talking about the team, but you expect those guys to be out there. And then Sean Payton had some nice things to say about Justin Strnad right at the end of mandatory minicamp. Drew Sanders getting all the reps that he's getting at inside linebacker is helpful for his development. And then you've got a number of guys who are undrafted. But then again, one of your top signings on the undrafted free agent market, Karene Reed, he was dealing with an injury during mandatory minicamp as well. So do the Broncos take any more calculated risks at inside linebacker? Another area that I think you could maybe double up with the wide receiver position is the return specialist position, right? You want to find guys who can help you out in the event that teams try to start kicking the ball away from Marvin Mims, because there's going to be, we assume, a huge uptick in kickoff returns this coming season. Marvin Mims stands to benefit from that. And because Marvin Mims stands to benefit from that, so do the Broncos. But as Marvin starts to get more opportunities early in the season, we could see teams start to kick away from him. Who are they going to be kicking to? There's no clear answer to that question on the Denver Broncos roster right now. There's nobody that really stands out as a dynamic secondary option in the return game. And heaven forbid Marvin Mims go down with any sort of injury, right? And so you want to make sure that you have that sort of depth in the return game right now because of how important that is going to be this coming season. So is there anybody out there? Was there anybody at the UFL level that was returning kicks? Was there anybody that was overlooked in this year's draft cycle who could be an interesting option to come in and help you return some kicks? I think that'll be an interesting question to answer for the Denver Broncos as we go along. But certainly you figure that if this team is adding at the cornerback position, that really nothing is off limits right now for this team, because cornerback is probably the deepest position on the team right now. I would say, along with the defensive line, which looks really deep and like you're going to have to move on from some really good players, as well as even you could argue running back. I know it's not the most proven position group, but it's deep enough now that the Broncos are going to either be cutting or moving on from some guys that could surprise some folks. So cornerback getting an addition in Mario Goodrich has got the gears turning for all the armchair GMs out there like myself. And I'm excited to see what the Broncos end up doing here as we approach. And we're in the midst of kind of the dog days of the offseason. And that's when a general manager can look at his roster. He can do some tinkering. George Paton and the Broncos, they have tons of flexibility. Again, like I mentioned, they have over $16 million in salary cap space currently, and that's not all going to get allocated directly towards, players that are being extended, right? Some of it could end up happening, but the Broncos have flexibility to take some calculated risks on free agents. We saw them do it with J.K. Dobbins. We could see them do it again. I don't know exactly who that would be. I don't know if there's any veterans out there that they would still be looking at, but when you talk about players that are showing out at the UFL level, or maybe some undrafted free agents that get lost in the shuffle elsewhere, this is that time of year where general manager and his front office can do some serious digging to find those diamonds in the rough. So Broncos country, can't tell you enough how much we appreciate you for rocking with us every single day here at Locked On Broncos. If you haven't already done so, again, we'd really appreciate if you hit subscribe, take a couple of seconds, support the show, and make us part of your day every single day. And you can also find some short form content from us over there at TikTok. So if you have a TikTok account, find Locked On Broncos, follow us over there. We're going to have short form content for you all year long, as well as on YouTube, where you can watch our YouTube shorts and get us into your algorithm that way. But Broncos country, there's never an off day in the off season. We appreciate you for rocking with us. We'll have you covered for another episode of the show tomorrow. Can't wait to see you on the next one.